The wrench slipped from Graham's oil-stained fingers, clattering against the concrete floor of his garage at 3:30 a.m., and he couldn't sleep again. The custom Harley-Davidson stretched before him, chrome gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, waiting for him to finish what he'd started 6 months ago. But every time he looked at those handlebars, all he could think about was Alyssa's hands gripping them during their first ride together, her laugh echoing in his helmet. "Oh, man," he muttered, wiping grease from his palms with a torn shop rag. His phone buzzed against the workbench, a text from his wife. "Can't sleep either. Come to bed?" Graham stared at the message, his jaw tightening. She'd been doing this for weeks now, reaching out in the middle of the night, trying to bridge whatever gap had opened between them. He knew what was eating at her. Hell, it was eating at him, too. 18 months of trying, of temperature charts and ovulation schedules and disappointment. The doctors had been clear after his testicular cancer treatment 6 years ago. Possible, but unlikely. His phone buzzed again. "Please, Graham. We need to talk," he almost typed back. Almost went upstairs to their bedroom where she lay awake in the darkness. Instead, he shoved the phone into his pocket and grabbed another wrench. The Harley's engine needed rebuilding, and working with his hands always helped him think clearer. 20 minutes later, he heard the front door slam. Graham's head snapped up from the carburetor he'd been cleaning. Footsteps on gravel, then the familiar purr of Alyssa's Honda Civic starting up. Through the garage's side window, he watched her taillights disappear down Maple Street toward the highway. "Where the heck is she going at 4 a.m.?" he said to the empty garage. When she returned 3 hours later, Graham was still in the garage, but now he was watching through the kitchen window, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands. Alyssa's face was red and puffy, her mascara smeared. She sat in the driveway for a full 5 minutes before getting out of the car, and when she finally walked through the door, she looked like she'd been through a war. "Where'd you go?" Graham asked, trying to keep his voice level. "Couldn't sleep. Went for a drive." She wouldn't meet his eyes. "Just needed air." "For 3 hours? Time got away from me." She brushed past him toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted. Going to try to sleep for a few hours before work." Graham watched her climb the stairs, noting how her shoulders shook with each step. Something was wrong. Something bigger than their fertility struggles. Bigger than the distance that had been growing between them, like a fault line. 2 weeks later, everything changed. "Graham?" Alyssa's voice cracked as she called from the bathroom. "Can you come here?" He found her sitting on the edge of their bathtub, a plastic stick trembling in her hands. 2 pink lines stared back at him like tiny accusers. "Holy..." Graham's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the tile floor. "Are you serious? Are you absolutely serious right now?" Alyssa nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of joy. They looked more like guilt. "How?" The word came out harsher than he intended. "I mean, we haven't been... It's been almost a month since we... I guess it just happened," she whispered, still not looking at him. "Sometimes these things just happen." Graham stared at the pregnancy test, his mind racing. They'd been trying for 18 months with no luck. And now suddenly, after weeks of barely touching each other, she was pregnant? The timing felt wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. But he pushed those thoughts down and pulled her into his arms because this was what they'd wanted, what they'd prayed for, what had been tearing them apart with its absence. "We're having a baby," he said into her hair, and for a moment, the doubt vanished. That evening, they drove to his parents' house for their weekly Sunday dinner. The Wolf family gathering was a tradition Graham had grown to dread over the years, but Alyssa insisted they maintain it. His parents, Lucille and Hank, lived in the old Victorian house where Graham had grown up, complete with the guest house where his younger half-brother Tyler had been living rent-free for the past 3 years. "You look radiant, dear," Lucille said, embracing Alyssa at the front door. Absolutely glowing. Graham's mother had always been fond of Alyssa, more so than she'd ever been of Graham himself. Sometimes he wondered if his parents had only tolerated his marriage because they genuinely liked his wife better than their own son. "We have news," Alyssa announced as they gathered around the dinner table. Tyler looked up from his mashed potatoes, that familiar cocky grin spreading across his face. At 28, he still carried himself like the high school quarterback he'd once been, all easy confidence and careless charm, everything that Graham had never been. "Don't tell me you finally got Graham to agree to get a dog," Tyler said, earning a laugh from their father. "Better than a dog," Graham said, reaching for Alyssa's hand. "We're having a baby." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Lucille's fork clattered to her plate, and she was up and around the table, pulling Alyssa into a fierce hug. "Oh, praise the Lord! Praise the Lord!" she cried. "I knew he would provide. I just knew it." Hank stood more slowly, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Well, I'll be damned. Good for you two, good for both of you." Tyler was the last to react. He set down his beer and raised it in a toast, that strange grin never leaving his face. "To new beginnings," he said, looking directly at Alyssa. "And getting what you really want." Graham noticed how Alyssa flinched when Tyler hugged her goodbye, how she seemed to shrink away from his touch. He noticed the way Tyler's hand lingered on her shoulder just a beat too long, but it wasn't until they were driving home that Graham found what would change everything. "Your coat pocket's buzzing," he said, as they pulled into their driveway. Alyssa fumbled for her phone, but a piece of paper fell out instead. Graham picked it up before she could stop him. Highway Motel, $67.50, cash payment. Room 23, 2 weeks ago. "What's this?" Graham's voice was deadly quiet. "I can explain," Alyssa said quickly. "It's not what you think." But Graham was already connecting the dots. 2 weeks ago, the night she'd disappeared for 3 hours. The night she'd come home crying and wouldn't explain why. "Get out of the car," he said. "Graham, please, get out of the car, now." That night, while Alyssa slept fitfully in their bed, Graham sat in his garage with his laptop, learning everything he could about electronic surveillance. By morning, he'd ordered a GPS tracker and keylogger software. By that evening, they were installed. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself the receipt meant nothing. But 3 days later, when the GPS showed Alyssa's car parked at the same highway motel for 2 hours while she was supposed to be at a work conference, Graham knew his marriage was over. He just didn't know yet how deep the betrayal went. The keylogger revealed text messages to someone saved in her phone as T. Short, cryptic exchanges that made Graham's blood run cold. T. "Can't stop thinking about yesterday, Alyssa. We can't keep doing this." T. "But you want to, Alyssa." "That's not the point. T. Meet me Thursday. Same place, Alyssa. This is the last time." But there were dozens of these exchanges going back months. Whatever was happening, it wasn't ending. Graham waited until Thursday. He followed her at a distance, his Harley's engine growling like a caged beast as he watched her Honda pull into the motel parking lot. He expected to see a stranger emerge from one of the rooms. He expected some faceless other man who would give him someone clear to hate. What he didn't expect was to see his brother Tyler walk out of room 23, straightening his shirt as Alyssa rushed toward him. Graham's hands tightened on the handlebars so hard he thought they might snap. He watched through the scope of pure rage as Tyler cupped Alyssa's face in his hands, as she melted into his embrace like she belonged there. They looked comfortable together. Natural. Like this was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon for them. The affair wasn't some desperate mistake driven by baby fever. This was something else entirely. Graham followed them back to town, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. Tyler went to the family house. Alyssa went to the grocery store, probably to establish her alibi. Graham went home and sat in his kitchen, staring at the pregnancy tests still sitting on the counter, and wondered whose child his wife was really carrying. The next morning, Alyssa found him in the garage at dawn, methodically taking apart the Harley's engine with surgical precision. "We need to talk," she said. "Do we?" Graham didn't look up from the cylinder head he was removing. "Graham, please, look at me." He set down his tools and finally turned to face her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The pregnancy glow his mother had mentioned was nowhere to be seen. "How long?" he asked. "What do you mean? How long have you been lying to me?" Alyssa's face crumpled. "Graham, how long have you been sleeping with my brother?" The words hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Alyssa's mouth opened and closed silently, and Graham saw the exact moment she realized there was no point in pretending anymore. "It was supposed to be just once," she whispered. "I was so desperate, Graham. The doctors said your chances were so low, and I wanted this so badly. I thought, maybe if Tyler could just help us." "Help us?" Graham's voice was getting louder. "You think sleeping with my brother was helping us?" "I thought about artificial insemination, but it's so expensive, and Tyler said he'd help. And it was supposed to be clinical, just to get pregnant, but then what?" Alyssa was crying, now ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "But then I started having feelings. I didn't mean to. I tried to stop it, but he was so kind to me, and you were so distant, and Graham was across the garage before she could finish the sentence, his hand slamming against the wall beside her head, hard enough to leave a dent in the drywall. "Don't you dare," he snarled. "Don't you dare make this my fault. I'm just trying to explain." "There's nothing to explain. You chose him. You chose to destroy our marriage. You chose to make me look like a fool in front of everyone who matters." "The baby could still be yours," Alyssa said desperately. "We don't know for sure." "Get out. Graham, get out." She fled toward the house, and Graham punched the wall again, hard enough to split his knuckles open. Blood dripped onto the concrete floor as he stared at the Harley's exposed engine, wondering how something so carefully built could be torn apart so completely. But the worst was yet to come. That afternoon, Graham drove to the old family house where Tyler lived in the guest house behind the main property. He found his brother working on a beat-up Camaro in the driveway, Bob Seeger playing on a battery-powered radio. "Well, well," Tyler said without looking up. "If it isn't the expectant father, we need to talk." "Do we?" Tyler straightened up, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. Even covered in motor oil, he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "I figured Alyssa would have filled you in by now." "She told me it was supposed to be just once, to help with the baby." Tyler laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that Graham had never heard from him before. "Is that what she said? Man, she really sold you a story, didn't she?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means your wife's been warming my bed for 6 months, brother. And it was her idea from the start." Graham felt something dark and violent unfurl in his chest. "You're lying." "Am I? Ask her about the motel room she rented. Ask her about the weekend trip to Cleveland she told you was for work. Ask her about the lingerie she bought specifically for me. Stop talking. Face it, Graham. She didn't come to me for a baby. She came to me because she wanted a real man." Graham's fist connected with Tyler's jaw before his brain had time to process the movement. Tyler staggered backward, blood streaming from his split lip, but he was grinning. "There he is," Tyler said. "There's the fighter I remember from when we were kids. Too bad it's about 20 years too late." Graham hit him again, harder this time. Tyler went down, rolling in the gravel, but he kept laughing. "You want to know the really funny part?" Tyler said, spitting blood. "Mom and Dad knew. They encouraged it. Said I was doing the family a favor." "You're lying. Ask them yourself. They're inside making dinner. I'm sure they'd love to explain their little plan to you." Graham left Tyler bleeding in the driveway and stormed toward the main house. He found his parents in the kitchen, Lucille stirring a pot of beef stew while Hank read the newspaper at the table. "We need to talk," Graham said. "Of course, son," Hank said, not looking up from the sports section. "How's our daughter-in-law feeling? Any morning sickness yet?" "Did you know?" Lucille's wooden spoon stopped stirring. Hank's newspaper rustled as he set it down. "Know what, son?" "Did you know about Tyler and Alyssa?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Lucille turned from the stove. "We knew you were struggling," she said carefully. "We knew how badly you both wanted a child." "That's not what I asked." "Sometimes," Hank said slowly, "God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he uses us in ways we don't expect." "Answer the question." "We suggested Tyler might be able to help," Lucille said. "Just medically, just to give you the family you wanted." "Medically?" Graham's voice was rising. "You thought it would be medical?" "We hoped it would stay that way," Hank said. "But if feelings developed, well, these things happen." Graham stared at his parents, feeling like he was seeing them clearly for the first time in his life. These people who had raised him, who had taught him about right and wrong, who had preached about family loyalty and Christian values. "You set this up," he said. "You orchestrated this whole thing." "We wanted grandchildren," Lucille said simply. "Tyler is young and healthy and not me." "Graham, you're being dramatic." "I'm being dramatic. My wife is pregnant with my brother's baby because you convinced her I wasn't man enough to do it myself, and I'm being dramatic." "That's not what happened," Hank said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? You've been treating me like damaged goods since the cancer. You've been waiting for me to fail, hoping I'd fail so Tyler could swoop in and save the day. That's not true. Get out of my way." Graham pushed past them toward Tyler's room, rage propelling him forward. He tore through drawers and closets until he found what he was looking for, a shoebox full of photos and letters hidden under Tyler's bed. Pictures of Tyler and Alyssa together. Not just intimate moments, but dates, dinners, road trips, A whole secret relationship documented in careful detail. Some of the photos were time-stamped going back 8 months. This wasn't about getting pregnant. This was a full-blown affair that had been going on almost since the beginning of their marriage troubles. But it was the letter at the bottom of the box that made Graham's world collapse entirely. The letterhead read, Lucille and Hank Wolf in his mother's careful script. It was addressed to Alyssa and dated 2 months before she'd gotten pregnant. Dear Alyssa, we've been praying about your situation with Graham, and we believe God has shown us a path forward. Tyler has agreed to help you conceive the child you both want so desperately. We know this is unconventional, but sometimes God asks us to step outside our comfort zones to achieve His will. We want you to know that we support this decision completely. Graham doesn't need to know the details, but he'll have the family he's always wanted, and you'll have the child you've been praying for. Tyler has promised to be discreet. We know you've been worried about finances, especially with the fertility treatments being so expensive. The enclosed check should help cover any expenses related to this arrangement. Consider it an investment in your family's future. With love and prayers, Lucille and Hank. Attached to the letter was a photocopy of a check made out to Alyssa Wolf for $10,000. Graham sat on Tyler's bed, staring at the letter until the words blurred together. His parents hadn't just known about the affair, they'd funded it. They'd paid his wife to sleep with his brother. They'd orchestrated the destruction of his marriage with the same careful planning most people use to organize family vacations. He thought about confronting them again, thought about storming back into that kitchen and demanding explanations. Instead, he put the letter in his pocket, left Tyler's photos scattered on the floor, and walked out of the house where he'd grown up. He had planning to do. The law offices of Martinez, Sullivan and Associates occupied a sleek downtown building that looked like it meant business. Graham sat across from Patricia Martinez, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s who specialized in family law and civil litigation. This is quite a situation, Mr. Wolf, she said, reviewing the copies of the letter and photos Graham had brought. Tell me what outcome you're hoping for. I want everything, Graham said. The house, the business, whatever assets we have. I want them to pay for what they did. Divorce proceedings can be emotionally charged, but Kentucky is a no-fault state. Adultery doesn't typically affect property division. What about fraud? Martinez raised an eyebrow. Explain. She took money from my parents to sleep with my brother. Doesn't that constitute some kind of fraud? Breach of contract? Something? Potentially. The financial arrangement adds an interesting element. Martinez leaned back in her chair. We could argue intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, perhaps even racketeering if we frame this as an ongoing criminal enterprise. Criminal? It's a stretch, but taking money to engage in adultery could be argued as a form of prostitution under certain interpretations of state law. The conspiracy between your parents, brother, and wife to defraud you of your marriage rights. There are angles we can pursue. Graham felt something cold and satisfied settle in his chest. What would that look like? Aggressive litigation. Civil suits against all parties involved. Full forensic accounting of all financial transactions. We make this as public and painful as possible. Do it. Mr. Wolf, I have to ask, are you sure you want to go this route? This kind of litigation gets messy. It gets expensive. It gets very, very public. Graham thought about Tyler's cocky grin, about his parents' casual dismissal of his feelings, about Alyssa crying crocodile tears while pregnant with another man's child. I'm sure. The first papers were served on a Tuesday. Graham made sure to be at his parents' house when the process server arrived, sitting on their front porch like he was just paying a social visit. Graham? Lucille opened the door with a confused smile. What are you doing here? Just wanted to see the look on your face when you got served. The process server stepped forward with official documents. Lucille Wolf, you're being served with a civil complaint for conspiracy, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Lucille's face went white as she took the papers. Graham, what is this? Justice, Mom. Something you apparently forgot to teach me about. Hank appeared behind her, reading over her shoulder. This is ridiculous. You can't sue your own family. Watch me. Tyler got served at the auto parts store where he'd been working part-time. Graham heard from a friend that he'd thrown the papers at the process server and stormed out, quitting his job in the process. Alyssa got served at her office, in front of all her co-workers. She called Graham that night, sobbing. How could you do this to me? I'm pregnant, Graham. How could you put me through this stress? You should have thought about that before you cashed my parents' check. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. And now everyone's going to know exactly what kind of person you really are. Graham hung up and blocked her number. The story broke in the local newspaper a week later. Small-town scandals traveled fast, and this one had everything: family betrayal, secret affairs, religious hypocrisy, and cold hard cash. The headline read, "Local family accused of paying for adultery in bizarre lawsuit." Graham's phone rang constantly with reporters, neighbors, and old friends wanting the inside story. He told them all the same thing: read the court documents. Everything you need to know is right there. The lawsuit did exactly what Graham had hoped it would do. It destroyed their reputation systematically and publicly. Hank was removed from his position as a church deacon. Lucille stopped showing her face in town. Tyler disappeared entirely, reportedly heading to Florida to live with some distant cousin. But Alyssa fought back. She hired her own attorney and filed a countersuit, claiming Graham had been emotionally abusive and that the money from his parents was a gift, not payment for services. She painted herself as a desperate woman trying to save her marriage, manipulated by older, more experienced people. "She's good," Martinez admitted after reviewing Alyssa's response. "She's positioning herself as another victim here." Then we hit harder. "Graham, there's something else. She's demanding a paternity test." "Good. Let's prove the kid isn't mine." "What if it is?" Graham hadn't considered that possibility. In his rage, he'd assumed the baby was Tyler's, but the timing was close enough that there was genuine uncertainty. The paternity test required a court order, which took 3 weeks to process. During that time, Graham felt like he was living in suspension, waiting for the results that would either validate his fury or complicate everything beyond repair. The results came back on a Friday afternoon. Martinez called him at the garage. "Graham, you need to sit down. Just tell me. The baby is yours. 99.7% certainty." Graham sank onto his workbench, the wrench in his hand suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Are you sure? DNA doesn't lie. Your wife was having an affair, but the baby she's carrying is biologically yours." Jesus Christ. This changes things significantly. She can argue that despite the affair, she was still trying to have your child. It muddies the emotional distress claims. What about the money? What about the conspiracy? Still valid. But a jury's going to see a pregnant woman carrying her husband's baby, and they're going to have sympathy for her. Graham closed his eyes. Part of him, a part he'd been trying to suppress for months, felt relief. The baby was his. Despite everything else, despite the betrayal and the lies and the money, he was going to be a father to his own biological child. But the larger part of him, the part that had been feeding on rage for weeks, only felt more betrayed. She'd been sleeping with Tyler even while carrying Graham's baby. She'd been playing them all against each other, hedging her bets. "I want to proceed," he said. "Full speed ahead. Graham, she took money to cheat on me. I don't care whose baby it is. That doesn't change what she did." The trial began on a cold Tuesday in November. The courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious locals who'd been following the scandal for months. Graham sat at the plaintiff's table watching Alyssa waddle into the courtroom, her pregnancy now visible to everyone. She looked fragile and sympathetic, exactly what her attorney had been going for. Graham looked like what he'd become, a man hardened by betrayal, seeking vengeance at any cost. "Your Honor," Martinez began her opening statement, "this case is about more than marital infidelity. This is about a conspiracy between 3 people to defraud my client of his marriage, his trust, and his dignity. The defendants engaged in a calculated scheme to manipulate Mr. Wolf's emotions while profiting from his wife's adultery." Alyssa's attorney, a grandfatherly man named Robert Chen, painted a different picture. "Your Honor, my client is a woman who made a mistake. She was desperate to have a child, manipulated by people she trusted, and now she's being persecuted by a vindictive ex-husband who wants to punish her for falling in love with the wrong person." The evidence phase was brutal. Martinez methodically presented the letter, the photos, the motel receipts, the bank records showing the $10,000 payment. She called witnesses who testified about seeing Tyler and Alyssa together in various locations around town. But the defense fought back hard. They presented Graham as a controlling husband who'd become distant and emotionally unavailable after his cancer treatment. They argued that Alyssa had sought comfort elsewhere because her marriage was already failing. "Mr. Wolf," Chen said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you and your wife hadn't been intimate for over a month Before she became pregnant? That's correct. And isn't it true that you'd been working 16-hour days in your garage, essentially abandoning your wife during a very difficult time? I was trying to build a business. Yes or no, Mr. Wolf? Were you emotionally available to your wife during this period? Graham felt every eye in the courtroom on him. No, I wasn't. So when she sought comfort elsewhere, you were angry not because you loved her, but because your pride was wounded. That's not true, isn't it? You've destroyed your entire family over this. Your parents are social pariahs. Your brother has fled the state. Your pregnant wife is facing financial ruin, all because you couldn't handle the fact that she found happiness with someone else. She took money to cheat on me, Graham said through gritted teeth. $10,000 over the course of a 6-month relationship works out to about $55 per week, Mr. Wolf. If your wife was being paid for her services, she wasn't being paid very well. The courtroom tittered with nervous laughter. Graham felt his face burn with humiliation. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with their verdict, Graham's hands were shaking. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Guilty. On the charge of fraud. Not guilty. It was a split decision. The jury had found that Lucille, Hank, and Tyler had conspired to cause Graham emotional distress, but they hadn't been convinced that the financial arrangement constituted fraud. Damages are awarded to the plaintiff in the amount of $150,000 to be paid jointly by the defendants. Graham felt a hollow victory settle in his chest. He'd won, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like everyone had lost. Alyssa was waiting for him outside the courthouse, her coat pulled tight around her swollen belly. Are you happy now? She asked. You've destroyed everything. You destroyed everything, Graham replied. I just made sure everyone knew about it. This baby is going to grow up knowing that its father chose revenge over family. This baby is going to grow up knowing the truth about its mother. Alyssa's face crumpled. I loved you, Graham. I still love you. What I did with Tyler, it wasn't about not loving you. But you did it anyway. Yes, I did it anyway. They stood there in the cold November air, two people who'd once promised to love each other forever, now strangers connected only by the child Alyssa carried, and the legal documents that would soon make their separation final. The divorce papers will be ready next week, Graham said. You'll get reasonable visitation, but I want primary custody. Graham, you can fight it, but after this trial, no judge is going to see you as the more stable parent. Alyssa nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. I know. Graham walked to his Harley, parked at the curb. As he started the engine, he looked back to see Alyssa still standing there, one hand on her belly, watching him leave. 6 months later, Graham stood in his garage, holding his son for the first time. Little Michael had Alyssa's dark hair and Graham's stubborn jaw. The baby looked up at his father with curious eyes, completely unaware of the war that had been fought over his existence. Alyssa had signed over primary custody without a fight. The scandal had cost her job, her reputation, and most of her friends. She'd moved to Indianapolis to live with her sister, visiting Michael every other weekend according to their custody agreement. Tyler never returned from Florida. Hank and Lucille had sold the family house and moved to a retirement community in Arizona, their once prominent standing in the community irreparably damaged. Graham had gotten everything he'd wanted: his son, his house, his business, and his revenge. But holding Michael in the empty garage, surrounded by the motorcycles he'd built with his own hands, he wondered if winning had been worth the cost. His phone buzzed with a text from Alyssa. How is he? Graham looked down at his sleeping son, then typed back, perfect. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the small Ohio town where everyone now knew the Wolf family's secrets. Graham locked the garage door, turned off the lights, and carried his son into the house where they would build a new life from the ashes of the old one. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky like the echo of a battle finally ended.